Joining us in studio now, our former commander of the 8200 Intelligence Unit at the IDF, Brigadier General in Reserves Hanan Geffen, and Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst and former Europe and Middle East Editor at the Associated Press. Thank you both for coming in. Let's talk about Blinken's visit. This, like I said, will be his 8th visit to the region. Dan, what do you think? What are the goals this time around?
I think the goal is to pressure both Israel and Hamas to accept the ceasefire, the three-stage ceasefire proposal that President Biden announced on May 31st. It's a bizarre set of circumstances because he presented it as Israel's own proposal.
Right.
So you would think that Israel does not need persuasion. But of course, there was some creative aspects to the presentation of that proposal, sort of remaining fuzzy about the question of whether Hamas gets to essentially stay in Gaza in power with the war ending. There's a lack of clarity about what the proposal actually entails as regards the day after. And also, it's no longer quite the same government in Israel as it was when the proposal was made public, because Benny Gantz, who undoubtedly was a factor pushing towards Israel's presenting such a proposal, is no longer in the government and therefore has lost whatever leverage he might have had. And I think he did have leverage. As for Hamas, and that is the other part of Blinken's visit to the region where he meets Arab leaders, the effort is to maintain and maximize the pressure that these Arab leaders place on Hamas to indeed accept a proposal that Israel itself may no longer be standing behind. And Hamas has demurred, and it's been almost 2 weeks, and they have not responded positively, and the signals are not particularly good. And Qatar has, in the meanwhile, stepped up and made public threats against Hamas that it should expel its good life-loving political leaders from Doha. It is very unclear if Hamas is pressurable.
Now, this is a similar, if not the same, outline that Hamas apparently agreed to previously.
But Hamas is asking for a very clear, unequivocal statement that they get to stay in power in Gaza after the war. And it's not just because they have a lust for power. It is because they want a victory narrative that would enable global jihadism to claim that Israel, and by implication the West, have failed in what was obviously is and continues to be an effort to dislodge them from Gaza, both as punishment for October 7th, but primarily because it cannot be tolerated that the risk of another October 7th should remain on Israel's borders. It is excruciating for Israel, and it does appear as if whatever are the details and the niceties and the ins and outs of the proposal, the choice may indeed be whether to put off the final reckoning with Hamas and return the hostages, or continue the war with all the attendant costs on every level for Israel internationally, and potentially sacrifice the remaining 116 hostages.
Do you believe that the Americans still think and believe that a ceasefire and hostage exchange deal can be achieved in the near future?
The fact that Blinken is here suggests yes. I do not have telepathic powers, but I do know that whatever they believe, their desire for a ceasefire is very, very strong, because with every day that passes and the November election approaches, the war endangers Biden's chances of re-election, because it's become perhaps history's most classic wedge issue, dividing the coalition that Biden needs to hold together between progressives and Muslims on the one hand, and Jews and liberals on the other.
There are many ways that were blocked, and one of them by Prime Minister Netanyahu. One of them is the day after entity. Will it be a Palestinian entity, approved, reformed Palestinian entity? He blocked all possibilities. Right now, we are standing with no solutions. With only ideas to proceed, but not a solution. And this really what worries Secretary Blinken, because chaos in Gaza means, clans fighting. There will be massacres, Arabs against Arabs.
So the Americans here trying to prevent that kind of chaos. Dan, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I wanted to be honest and say that there is a real danger in agreeing to leave Hamas in power in Gaza. And I say this as a person who has more than hinted that I think I would choose the ceasefire plan. But the biggest danger for Israel and the Arab regimes that Hanan was talking about is that Hamas becomes more and more powerful among the Palestinians. And public opinion on the Palestinian side, as really in most societies, really is driven by narratives. And if Hamas is allowed to credibly promote a narrative where they won the war. And I fear that will be the case if they remain in power. However great the destruction in Gaza, that may guarantee that they end up with 70, 80% support among the Palestinians, which will in turn guarantee that there cannot be an accommodation with the Palestinians. And all this talk about the day after becomes a little bit more than premature and potentially utterly fictitious, because then we are headed for truly a century's worth of war between Jews and Arabs in this country. So I am not sanguine about how dangerous it is to allow the Palestinian jihadi movement to score a victory, not just for the Palestinian jihadis, but for jihadis in general. It will encourage copycat activity and move public opinion in that direction all over the region, which is dangerous for Israel too, because it endangers its allies in Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I say Saudi Arabia already, and especially Jordan. It is the connection between all the countries surrounding Israel and what happens in this war and the outcome really is profound. Which is why, if you talk about narratives, it really is devastating that Netanyahu has refused to throw the moderate Arabs a bone by discussing the potential for a day after Hamas that involves a true alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the moderate Arab countries. And that is where the Gantz issue becomes relevant. I know you want to show his words. We can discuss it
Let's
after.
discuss that right now. Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz has quit the emergency government in a sign of deepening divisions over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's post-conflict plans for Gaza. Gantz announced his resignation at a press conference in Tel Aviv last night, accusing Netanyahu of preventing Israel from approaching true victory. Dan, how do you believe that this move will impact the government looking forward?
I think it'll make it less likely that Netanyahu can engage in the day after discussion constructively, which we all think, I think we agree, and most of Israel's security establishment would agree is the right thing. He's been refusing to do that, not because, or at least not only because he's personally obstinate, but because his government of 64 out of 120 depends on 14 far-right seats. And Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, which is a shorthand for the 14 far-right seats, has vetoed any such discussion of the day after Hamas, which, by the way, doesn't help remove Hamas from power, because there probably are no more than basically two variants. A variant of the Palestinian Authority with moderate Arab support and all the rest of it, or some continuation of Hamas. And if you refuse to even contemplate the PA and promote this ridiculously nonsensical narrative that the PA and Hamas are somehow equally as bad, then you're leaving Hamas in power by implication and by default. So Benny Gantz didn't really ever control the government. He has 8 seats, right? So, I mean, the far right always had more power. But Netanyahu wanted him in place because Benny Gantz's moderate party gave the government a veneer of international legitimacy, and it helped with the Americans, and it prevented the government from being portrayed as a cabal of right-wing lunatics. And with Benny Gantz gone, the pressure on Israel increases, but also Gantz's leverage is gone. So at this point, good luck to Blinken trying to figure out how to get Netanyahu to agree to these positive, confidence-building, narrative-furthering moves when he depends completely and totally on the far right. It is clearly a bad situation. Gantz did it for a variety of reasons, and he's hoping to compel new elections. But it honestly does seem like you could have a plague of locusts and a nuclear attack by China, and the 64 coalition will stay in power. And in parliamentary democracies, let's look at what happened in France yesterday. There was something of a failure in what normally is a marginal event, the European Parliament elections, and Macron said, all right, I've lost the confidence of the people, and he dissolved parliament. That's kind of what you're supposed to do in a parliamentary democracy, but Israel's variant is clinging to their seats with their fingernails in a way that is most undignified and certainly not conducive to a positive outcome to the war. Having spent many years in the Arab world, I agree with Hanan that there's a real difference between the elites and power and sort of the people at large, and then also educated people not in power, which is a third group, like academics and so forth, especially among the latter. The more educated people who are not necessarily in power, so aren't part of the alliance with Israel. There is a very, very, very strong feeling that there is no difference between Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu and even Gantz Now, they kind of get that the Israeli moderates and liberals are a little bit different, maybe more clever in messaging Israel's nefarious end goals, but certainly they see no difference between Israeli right and Israeli far right, which I do. They think it's all a far right conspiracy to expel the Palestinians. And it would, I mean, it is shocking how many educated people who are friends of mine in the Arab world actually believe that Israel's end goal is to expel the Palestinians. So when, because they think the Israelis are not foolish enough to blunder into a binational state that's not democratic. They can't believe that. So the only logical thing the Israelis might want, from their view, is to expel the Palestinians. Now, I've found it impossible to dissuade them. And they seize on every instance of a hint from far-right people in Israel that, that this is somehow, some version of this should happen. As evidence, and they simply don't believe Netanyahu and the mainstream Israeli right in Israel.
In a very funny way, just to continue, a twisted way, they believe Netanyahu is powerful. They believe he's much powerful than he is really.
Than he really is.
Yeah, they believe he is the source of all the decisions. This is a very twisted
They can't
way.
believe he's being dragged along by
that's-
Ben Gvir and Smotrich, which in fact is what's happening.
Yeah.
Well, Dan Perry and Hanan Geffen, thank you very much for this important input. Thank you.